I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 14. High Seas Abduction. Greenland-Iceland Gap, USS America. Seth stood on the bridge of the warship, along with the captain of the ship, Drake Connor, and the Marine colonel in charge of the contingent of Marines on board, Tony Del Monte. The three of them watched as several CH-53 Super Stallions loaded up a Marine fast team to go after the yacht the analytical team at Camp Perry had identified as the ship most likely carrying Marshal Tate. Accompanying the Super Stallions were two attack helicopters, which would provide them with additional support should they need it, and which carried the two Delta operators that had been accompanying Seth. The America and her contingent of 4 other naval ships were now less than 70 miles from the yacht. Once the helicopters left, the ships would move to flank speed as they tried to further close the distance between them and the target. Colonel Del Monte turned to look at Seth, who was still dressed in his 5'11" clothes. "I hope your intel is good," he said dryly. "I don't want my Marines to get jammed up on a dry hole." "It's as good as we're going to get, sir," Seth insisted. Captain Connor turned to him. "You going to level with me and the colonel here and tell us who the hell you're holding on my ship and why 2 Delta operators are going with our Marines on a mission they should be able to handle?" he asked in a low voice, glancing around to make sure no one could hear him. "Yeah, that's a good question," echoed Colonel Del Monte. "I think this is the first time in my Marine career that I've seen 2 Delta guys accompany my men and not a couple of SEALs. What gives?" Seth motioned with his head for them to walk out of the bridge, away from prying ears. He knew the 2 of them really wanted to know who'd been brought aboard their ship. All they had seen was 2 men wrapped in black hoods being escorted by a couple of JSOC operators. They'd been told explicitly by the CNO, Admiral Smith, to honor any requests made by Seth Mitchell and his team, and not to ask any questions. However, seeing that they were about to capture Marshal Tate, Seth figured he might as well tell them what was going on. There wasn't a reason to keep things secret at this point. Seth surveyed the area to make sure no one else could hear them. Then he explained. "The first guy we brought aboard was Lance Solomon." Captain Connor just shook his head and let out a soft whistle. "The head of Goldman Sachs and the second most wanted man in America? Wow." He uttered a few curse words under his breath. "You guys actually tracked him down to Norway?" "Yeah, well, it wasn't easy. We had to cut a deal with the second guy we brought aboard to get him to snitch on him." "Okay, then who is the second guy?" asked Del Monte, his curiosity obviously piqued. "You know who Eric Jan is?" "You mean the Norwegian money guy who funded this entire charade?" asked Captain Connor. Seth nodded. "He's the second guy we're holding." "Ah, damn, you guys are good," said Colonel Del Monte excitedly. "They only announced who these traitors were a few weeks ago, and you guys already found them." It wasn't that easy," Seth replied. "We basically told the Norwegians they either hand Solomon over to us or we'd start bombing Oslo. They gave him up. But convincing him to talk required a lot of horse trading. He still may end up walking if he can give up a few more people." He still wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. "Hey, whatever you have to do to get all the people involved in this, do it," said the captain, conviction in his voice. "If he has to walk so we get everyone else, it's a fair swap. You hear me?" Seth nodded his head. "I suppose we should go down to the CIC to monitor the raid." "Nah. We have at least 30 minutes before they're close to the target," remarked Captain Connor with a flip of his hand. "Let's just enjoy the fresh air for a few minutes before we're stuck in that cold, poorly lit room." The three of them chuckled. 40 minutes later, the trio watched the raid on one of the video monitors in the CIC while it was happening. They had several surveillance drones up at this point, providing them with multiple angles. The Cobra attack helicopters hovered on either side of the super yacht, making sure the people on the ship knew not to try any funny business. Next, one of the two super stallions hovered over the rear of the ship, and a string of Marines slid down the ropes onto the yacht. The other super stallion did the same, only it hovered at the front of the ship. In the span of less than 60 seconds, they had dropped 24 Marines and 2 JSOC operators onto the ship. The JSOC operators made a beeline for the interior of the ship, with the Marines covering their 6 and clearly everything else. Once the Americans were on the ship, 2 of the video screens in the CIC switched over to the team leader in the rear of the ship and the team leader in the front of the ship. They watched as the boarding party swept through the yacht and secured it. Sure enough, within minutes of landing on the ship, the JSOC operators had found Senator Marshall Tate hiding in one of the staterooms with his wife. The Marines disarmed the half-dozen security guards, along with the crew. They lined the crew all up on the front deck of the ship, while they waited for the America and its strike group to catch up to them. It took nearly 2 more hours for the squadron of ships to rendezvous with the mega yacht, but once they did, a number of small boats disembarked from the America and the destroyers to surround the yacht. Marshall Tate was brought over to the America and handed over to Seth and his team for further questioning. Once the Americans had what they had come for, they released the Russian crew and security personnel to continue on with their journey. The entire incident took less than 3 hours to resolve without a single life lost in the process. Seth watched Senator Marshall Tate sitting in the interrogation room and wondered what was going through the man's head. Tate had to realize the futility of his situation, but Seth tried to calculate the best approach to get him to disclose any further participants of the plot. More importantly, Seth wondered if there was a way to get him to speak with his supporters and tell them that the fight was over and that they should shift their concerns to the real fight, the one against the Chinese. "You going to show him the video?" asked Ashley Bonhoff as she stared at Tate. Since she was FBI, General Lancaster had thought that she might be able to add some additional leverage should Seth be unable to break Tate. Seth nodded. "I think it might be enough to get him to make an appeal to his followers." Ashley placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can do this, Seth," she insisted. "I've seen you work your magic. You can do it one more time." She stared into his eyes a little longer than she probably should have. Smiling at the encouragement, Seth noticed her lingering glance. He'd spent a lot of time with her over the past 2 months, and it had been nearly 4 months since he'd seen his own family. He brushed off the thoughts that were suddenly trying to break through to his mind and returned to the task at hand. Grabbing the tough book on the table next to him, he got up and walked out the door. He made his way down the corridor to the room where they were holding Tate. The guard unlocked the door and held it open for him to enter, which he did. Senator Tate scrutinized Seth and his plain clothes as he walked into the room and sat down at the opposite side of the table. Seth glared at the man who had so divided his nation. He tried not to let how he felt about his prisoner rise to the surface, but he had to admit, of all the people he had interrogated up to this point, Marshall Tate had pushed him to the edge. "What are you going to do with me?" asked the senator, concern and fear written on his face. Turning his head slightly to the left, Seth replied, "That largely depends on how willing you are to talk with me." "And if I choose not to talk?" To wait until my lawyer arrives?" asked Tate. Seth laughed at the ludicrous nature of the question. "Senator, where exactly do you think we are?" he asked. "I'm on a U.S. warship, which means I'm on U.S. soil," Tate replied smugly. "The Constitution still applies to me, and I still have rights." "I'm not sure if you remember, but the President and the Congress labeled you and the members of your cabinet enemy combatants. You betrayed your oath of office and led an attempt to overthrow the federal government. You may be on a U.S. warship, but you have no rights." Seth replied with a certain amount of satisfaction. "I'm not saying another word until I speak with my lawyer," Tate insisted. Seth felt his jaw tighten. "You have two choices, Senator. You can either cooperate and answer my questions truthfully, in which case the DOJ may decide to show you some leniency, or I can pull out my bag of tricks and make you talk. But keep in mind, Senator, I'm very good at my job, and I will make you tell me everything I want to know." Marshal Tate recoiled a bit in his chair. "You mean torturing me for the information?" he inquired. "You know that's against the Geneva Convention." "Senator, you threw out any protection you had under international law or our own Constitution when you led a civil war against our country. You knowingly participated in the theft of our election. You can deny it all you want, but we have sworn statements from Roberto Lamy, Lance Solomon, and Eric Jan attesting to that fact." Leaning in, Seth added, "The jig is up. It's time to come clean and hope leniency will be granted to you. If not, then I will have no choice but to extract the information I need from you through any and all means necessary." Seth watched Tate's facial expressions. The smug, arrogant look he'd worn so proudly a moment before had faded. His body suddenly slumped in the chair, and in that moment he looked deflated. Seth had seen that look hundreds of times before. Time to press in, he thought. "Senator, as you know, the UN peacekeeping force has collapsed. Nearly all the nations that were part of it have either surrendered or are in the process of making peace with the U.S. The two countries that have not come to the table are Russia and China. I'm going to go with the position that you didn't fully know what was happening, that you may not have fully understood this grand scheme that was using you as its pawn. But right now, you do have some power to help end this civil war." Tate looked up at Seth with an expression that seemed like a sad puppy. "How?" he asked defeatedly. "How can I help to end this civil war? Everything has been proven to be a charade, a sham. Even I didn't know how big this thing was until the wheels of war had already been set into motion. I was just told to shut up, to play along, and do my part, and I'd be president for 8 years. I honestly had no idea the level of duplicity that was going on. I'm not sure there is anything more I can do to help." Seth watched as any semblance of strength Tate had portrayed moments before collapsed. Seeing that his subject was sufficiently prepped, Seth walked over to the DVD player in the room and started up the video. As Marshal Tate watched the footage of the mass graves in Mexico and of the women being loaded into the Chinese ships, he started crying. Soon he was sobbing uncontrollably at the weight of it all. With tears streaming down his face, Marshall pleaded, "What can I possibly do to help? How will anyone ever believe what I say after all that's happened?" Seth leaned forward. "First, you need to disclose everything you know about this plot to remove Sachs. Next, you need to come clean about your part in all of this, what they promised you, and what they wanted you to do in exchange. Third, we need you to make a desperate appeal to your supporters and to the governors of the states that were backing you. We need you to help us convince them that the Chinese aren't coming to liberate them, but rather to occupy and kill them. Most importantly, we need your help to reunite the country so we can focus on fighting the Chinese as a cohesive force instead of fighting amongst ourselves while dealing with the Chinese. Do you think you can handle that? Tate didn't say anything for a moment. Then he wiped a few tears from his cheeks and nodded. "Enough people have died because of me," he said, his voice still a bit shaky and emotional. "This bloodshed needs to end. I'll do it. Tell me what you guys need from me and I'll do it." Seth nodded, then got up, but before he left, he turned back to Tate. "Senator, thank you," he uttered. "I'm going to send in a woman by the name of Ashley Bonhoff. She's a deputy assistant director with the FBI. She'll go over what we need you to say and who we specifically need you to reach out to. We'll create a video, and then we'll provide you with a sat phone. There's probably about 24 people we need you to personally plead with for peace." Seth then undogged the hatch and walked out of the room. He walked over to where Ashley had been monitoring the interrogation and signaled it was now her turn. She stood and winked at him. She grabbed her pad of paper and the portable camcorder she had already mounted on a table tripod for this very purpose. When she left the room, Seth made a quick call to Camp Perry to bring them up to speed on what had transpired and to let them know that Senator Tate had agreed to make the necessary phone calls. Seth felt a wave of relief. This just might be enough to stop the Civil War. Chapter 15. Operation Spartacus. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Robert Lucas looked at the two Special Forces soldiers dressed in regular civilian clothes sitting on his couch with skepticism. He wasn't sure if these guys were being genuine or if they were simply trying to test him and see how committed his little crew of like-minded people were. Leaning forward in his lazy-boy rocking chair, Robert asked, "Are you serious about this plan?" The leader, a man who only went by the call sign Punisher, answered, "Deadly. Is your band of patriots willing to work with us?" Robert sighed at the thought of carrying out a mission like this. He just wasn't sure. This is the kind of stuff that would bring a lot of heat down on them by the occupational authorities. He leaned back in his chair and rocked slowly as he thought about it. He'd served in the Army himself during the First Gulf War, but he'd been out of the Army for 15 years. While he'd managed to rally close to 20 like-minded patriots, he wasn't sure if this was a mission they could reasonably take on and survive. "So, if I understand this right, one of your guys is going to give us IEDs and locations of where and when you want them placed around town and the highways?" "Exactly," replied the soldier. "We'll build them so you don't have to worry about them accidentally going off. We've also scouted out all the locations we'd like you to place them, and will provide instructions about when and how to do so." Robert squinted. "How do you know when to place them, and what's so special about these specific locations?" he inquired. A smile crept across the soldier's face. "Let's just say complacency and a sense of security makes people do stupid things." The soldier paused for a second as he surveyed Robert's face. "Look, I know this is dangerous work, but your group knows the area well. You've been providing good intelligence of what's been going on in the city for more than a month. We aren't locals, and we can only be in so many places at once. With your help, we'll be able to do a lot more, a lot faster. It's imperative that we do our best to tie down Chinese resources here in Albuquerque. It's that many less soldiers our guys have to face up in Colorado. It'll also inspire other patriots in the area to take up arms and make a stand. We're already carrying out sniper operations along I-25 just south of the city, Robert countered. We've managed to hit several of them already. We know. That's why we believe you guys could be used for this operation as well. This'll really get you into the action, where you can do a lot more damage. Robert paused, then nodded. Okay, we'll do it. Let's talk about how you're going to get the IEDs to us, and how you want this to go down. The next hour was spent going over those specific details. They also gave Robert several sets of wireless communication devices, so they could effectively communicate before and during each attack. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Jose arrived at the dilapidated building Robert had told him about. The structure was a dingy old auto repair shop, a simple 3-car garage that used to be a gas station at one point in its life. As he hopped out of his truck, Jose saw a man smoking a cigarette in the shadows near the entrance to the office and waiting room. Jose approached him. "I was told you were able to fix CV joints for a good price," he said. The man in the shadows flicked his cigarette to the ground as he emerged from the darkness. "I can. We're running a special on them for $49.99 per joint. How many do you need?" The man from the shadows walked towards Jose, who felt his pulse quickening as the stranger approached. "I need 3, he answered. As the man came into view from one of the nearby streetlights, Jose saw a slight smile creep across his face. Then he extended his hand. "Sounds like we have a deal. My name is Janice. Why don't you come inside? I have a loaner car I can let you borrow." "Thank you. My name is Jose." Jose followed the man inside the shop. They made their way into one of the rooms in the back. A light was on there, and a map of the city was taped to the wall. Jose scrutinized Janice as he walked up to the map. The guy looked like one of those people he might cross the street to avoid walking past him at night. Jose couldn't say for sure, but this guy looked like a convict to him. "Robert sure knows how to find some interesting people," he thought. "Okay, Jose. You're going to drive the vehicle I'm going to lend you to this location here," Janice instructed, pointing to a bus parking lot on the corner of Louisiana and Gibson. "Once you've dropped the vehicle, I need you to walk down the block on Louisiana Boulevard and catch the bus. I want you to stay on the bus and get off at the 3rd stop. Another man in a beat-up-looking Ford Escort is going to pick you up and bring you back here. Then I'll have the next vehicle ready for you with your new assignment." The man paused for a moment before asking, "Do you have any questions?" Jose just shook his head. It seemed simple enough. Janice nodded and walked them into the 3-car garage connected to the little office, where he showed Jose a 2015 BMW 3 Series vehicle. Suddenly, Janice grabbed Jose by the arm and leaned in. "Do not deviate from the plan," he hissed, in a manner that was half warning and half threat. "Bring the vehicle to the bus parking lot and park it with the rear of the vehicle facing Gibson Boulevard. Put the sunshade in the front just like every other driver does." Then he repeated his previous instructions. "Walk to the bus stop a block further down Louisiana Boulevard. Catch the next bus and get off at the 3rd stop. I'll see you back here when you're done." Jose listened intently, and nodded at each step in the instructions. Then the man let go of his arm and handed him the keys to the car. Jose got into the vehicle, started it, and then drove out of the garage to exactly where he'd been told. He parked it exactly as he'd been instructed, locked it, then walked further down the street to the bus stop and patiently waited. It was only 6 a.m, and the street was quiet. "I guess there won't really be a rush hour here anymore," Jose realized. Ever since the Chinese had taken the base over, there were no service members, contractors, or government workers to staff it. When Jose got off on the 3rd stop, he spotted a man in a dirty, banged-up Ford Escort. Without saying a word, Jose got into the Ford and they drove away. 15 minutes of silence went by as they drove back to the garage. Once there, Janice handed him a maintenance coverall. "Put this on," he instructed. When he'd finished that task, Janice walked him over to what appeared to be a Burlington Northern Santa Fe utility truck with a bright orange BNSF painted on the side. "You're going to drive this to the main train yard and park it near the railroad turntable," Janice directed. "Once you've parked, make up an excuse to go to the convenience store across the street and exit through the back door. The man who drove you here earlier will meet you out back and take you back here." Jose nodded and took off. 30 minutes later, he was about to pull into the train yard when he was greeted by a couple of armed private security guards and 2 BNSF workers that were manning a checkpoint to the facility. "Crap, no one told me there would be guards," he thought. He could feel his pulse rate increasing and his palms turned sweaty. "Please step out while we search your vehicle," ordered one of the guards. Jose was almost frozen. His mind panicked. "How the hell do I get out of this?" he wondered. Then he heard a voice say, "You know he was cleared yesterday, right?" There were a couple of comments back and forth between the rail yard worker and the hired guns, but then they waved Jose on in without any further trouble. As he drove the truck through the gate, the rail yard worker winked at Jose, as if telling him, "I have your back." When the truck was completely out of view of the security guards, Jose breathed a huge sigh of relief. That was way too close. He parked the truck where he'd been told, which was oddly nowhere near the locomotives. He got out, steeled his nerves, and walked back to the security checkpoint. Jose had noticed on the way in that one of the guards' name tags read Phil, so as he approached the gaggle of armed men, he called out, "Hey, Phil," in a friendly voice. The man popped his head out of the guard shack. "Yeah?" he asked. "I need to use the bathroom and grab another pack of cigarettes before work starts. I'm just going to walk over to the 7-Eleven real quick. Do you guys want me to bring anything back for you?" "Thanks for the offer, man, but we're good," Phil replied. And just like that, Jose was through the checkpoint again with no issues. He walked into the store, all the way through to the back, and then exited the back door. The same man from the garage was there to drive him back. The two of them drove back to the shop, where Jose grabbed a third vehicle. 30 minutes later, he had driven to the overpass just north of Tramway Boulevard and Interstate 25. Following the instructions Janice had given him, when Jose reached a specific landmark, he hit a small button that caused his car to start smoking. His vehicle rolled to a stop just in front of the overpass. Jose got out of the vehicle and lifted the hood, which allowed even more smoke to escape. A soldier had rigged up a little device that spilled a bunch of oil on the hot engine, making it appear that this car had overheated. Jose looked around. A taxicab pulled up nearby and stopped. Sure enough, the same guy from the garage was sitting in the driver's seat. Jose hopped in, and then the two of them drove back to the garage. This time Janice handed him back the keys to his truck. "Go home," he ordered. Stay out of sight for a few days, and just play it cool. If anyone finds out you were the guy who had delivered the vehicles, then we'll tell you when and where to go next. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Safe house. Are the VBIEDs in place? Asked Punisher. His explosives expert, who went by the call sign Bang Bang, nodded. Our guy drove them to the various locations. Janice radioed in every time one was delivered. Okay. Then let's detonate the one at the rail yard, Punisher ordered. That's the one that's most likely to get discovered the longer it sits there. Bang Bang smiled and grabbed his burner phone. He placed a call to the phone in the BNSF truck that would act as a trigger device. Well? Asked Punisher impatiently. Rang once and disconnected, just like it's supposed to. Bang Bang replied with a devilish grin. 1 down, 2 to go. 20 minutes went by before Janice, who had been observing the defunct American Air Force Base from nearby, radioed in. That convoy of buses is leaving. They're nearly to the site. The next flight of new soldiers must have arrived, another one of the SF soldiers said in a jovial manner. Punisher chuckled. Well, let's make sure to give them a warm welcome to America, shall we? Bang Bang nodded, and they all watched the remote surveillance camera they had placed nearby. Sure enough, a column of 15 buses was driving away from the defunct American Air Base and heading into the city. They all knew most of these soldiers would travel to the BNSF railroad vehicle storage lot. The PLA had been making heavy use of the American and Mexican railroad networks to move their armored vehicles and tanks to the front lines, and they needed the soldiers who could operate the equipment. They watched in anticipation as the vehicles drove along the most expected path. When the 5th bus traveled into the kill zone, Bang Bang depressed the call button to the second burner phone, which would activate the next car bomb. To make this particular VBIED more deadly, there were 3 layers of ball bearings glued to the inner shell of the trunk, and it had been packed with block after block of C4, with a piece of metal welded behind it. Bang Bang had basically turned the car into a gigantic claymore mine that would devastate whatever it was aimed at. In a fraction of a second, the boulevard was thrown into utter chaos as one of the PLA buses was blown completely apart, throwing huge chunks of shrapnel into the buses in front of it and behind it. Both of those buses were so damaged that they careened off the road. Several of the other buses in the convoy were also hit by ball bearings, but nothing like the first 3. In the blink of an eye, 3 buses and over 100 PLA soldiers had been wiped out. Damn, Bang Bang, said one of the SF soldiers. You're going to have to write up how you build those VBIEDs so we can spread that around to the other groups and partisans we're building up. Bang Bang laughed. Sure thing. Punisher stood up and stretched. Now we sit and wait until either a PLA unit investigates our 3rd VBIED, or we see a military convoy drive near it, he announced. What's the plan for tomorrow, boss? You have more of these we're going to place? Asked Crispy, their other demolition guy. While Bang Bang had been building VBIEDs for the resistance to use, Crispy had been constructing a variety of IEDs. He'd been super clever with how he was camouflaging them so they could hide in plain sight. Punisher looked back and forth between Bang Bang and Crispy. How many VBIEDs and IEDs do we have ready to go? He asked. Bang Bang replied first. I have 2 more VBIEDs, just like the ones we saw today, ready to go. I'm working on getting 5 more, but I'm at least 3 or 4 days from having them ready. Crispy added, I have 12 IEDs ready to go. I can probably crank out more, but we're starting to run out of C4. Any idea on when we'll get another supply drop? Punisher smiled mischievously. As a matter of fact, yes. In 2 days, we're supposed to head out to the dead drop." "Excellent," said Crispy. "Then, do you want my crew to start placing the IEDs, or Bang Bang's crew?" "I think it's your crew's turn, Crispy," answered Punisher. "Bang Bang, get working on more of your car bombs. We'll look to introduce more of them around town next week, once the PLA is sufficiently scared of Crispy's IEDs. But in the meantime, I want you guys to make sure that wherever we end up placing these devices, we do our absolute best to minimize the risk of civilian casualties. I know we can't rule them out entirely, but it's our job to make sure we aren't placing these devices in heavily populated areas where a lot of people will be present. We want to hurt the PLA, but we don't want to turn the public against us. Got it, guys?" "We know, boss. We're doing our best to make sure that doesn't happen." Albuquerque, New Mexico, Johnson Field. Mikhail Lazarev stood next to Colonel Commandant Song Pichuan as they watched the last bus unload its human contents. For the last 3 hours, some 2,000 civilians had been rounded up and brought to the University of New Mexico to bear witness to the consequences of supporting an insurgency against their benevolent liberators. Colonel Commandant Song turned to look at the Russian standing next to him. Speaking just loud enough so only the two of them would hear, he asked, "You really believe this is going to work and not cause us further problems?" Mikhail shrugged his shoulders. "Does it matter? The hostages will either give up the names of the people working with the resistance, or they won't. In either case, this execution will serve as a warning to anyone else who might want to take up arms." Song nodded at the callousness of the Russian. If these Russian mercenaries could end this growing insurgency in his city, it would go a long way towards pacifying the city. Just then, Mayor Delgado, the mayor of Albuquerque, walked up to them. "Excuse me, Colonel. I am asking that you please don't do this," he begged. "Please allow me to talk with my citizens and try to talk some sense into them." Mikhail smirked at the American. "Your lovely citizens killed 130 peacekeepers. Many more were maimed and injured, Mr. Mayor. We need to show your renegade citizens that this type of behavior is unacceptable." Undeterred by the Russian's comments, Major Delgado pressed, "Colonel, please, if you want to convey the message that you're here to liberate our state from the Sachs regime, then you can't just kill our people like this. It'll only fuel this insurgency." Colonel Song sighed. "Mr. Mayor, you may speak with the hostages, but unless they tell us who is working with the insurgency, they are going to be made into examples." Delgado smiled and bowed slightly. "Thank you, Colonel." The mayor headed over to the gymnasium nearby to try and speak with his residents. Some 260 men, women, and teenagers were in the building. For 10 minutes, the mayor pleaded with them to provide any information they could to the Chinese. Several took him up on the offer, but many more called him a collaborator and traitor for working with the enemy. Those who agreed to talk were brought to a side room where they were questioned. Everyone else, however, was marched out to the open field. When Mayor Delgado left the auditorium, he tried to walk towards the bleachers where the citizens of Albuquerque were sitting. He had nearly made it there when one of the Russian mercenaries walked up to him. "You're wanted by Colonel Song," the man said gruffly. Delgado approached the Chinese commander again. "Please, Colonel, the ones who know something are already talking to your people." "Enough!" barked the Chinese officer. "You've made your case. I gave you an opportunity to talk some sense into them. It is now time to render judgment." As the group of Americans who'd waited in the gym stood at one end of the athletic field, a loudspeaker blared at the thousands of citizens who had been dragged from their homes and places of work to witness the public execution. "This is what will happen to you if you attack our forces. Watch!" Some of the Russian mercenaries pointed guns at the crowd to make sure they would see what was about to unfold. Another group of 20 Russians moved into position between the hostages and the people in the bleachers. They set up a couple of light machine guns on their tripods and readied them to fire. "Ready? Aim! Fire!" someone shouted. While the mayor and a few other city officials stood there, the Russians opened fire on the hostages. The machine gunners were swift and ruthless as they fired into the crowd of unarmed people. When the shooting had stopped, the people in the bleachers wailed and cried. None of them could believe what they'd just witnessed. A few desperate souls amongst the hostages who'd been shot but remained alive cried out for help. Before the mayor could say or do anything, the leader of the Russian mercenary group grabbed him by the collar and dragged him to the pile of bodies. He eventually found a wounded person lying on the ground, a woman who'd been shot several times. She reached her hand out to the mayor. "Help me, please," she pleaded. Mikhail pulled a small pistol out of one of his cargo pockets and handed it to the mayor. "Put her out of her misery, Mr. Mayor," he instructed with a sickeningly sweet voice. "End her suffering." Delgado looked at the Russian in horror. He dropped the pistol to the ground. "You put her out of her misery." "How about we do this?" asked Mikhail, grinning sadistically. "You either pick up the pistol and shoot the wounded, or my men will turn their machine guns around and begin shooting all the people in the bleachers. Which would you rather do?" "You're sick." Mikhail yelled something in Russian, and a second later his guys had turned the 4 machine guns around to face the civilians in the bleachers. The people shrieked with fear. Then the sobbing, screams of horror, and profanity started up again. "Pick up the weapon now and finish off the wounded, or I'll order my men to fire," Mikhail ordered. 5, 4, 3... Delgado picked up the pistol from the ground and aimed it at the woman. He pulled the trigger once, hitting her in the face. Her body fell backwards to the ground, dead. "Good. Now walk with me. You're going to finish off the rest of them. If you try to shoot me or any of my men, they will kill everyone in the bleachers. So think about them before you try something stupid," Mikhail instructed. The next 5 minutes were the worst moments of the mayor's life. When he had finished killing the last of the wounded hostages off, the people in the bleachers were permitted to leave and go home. The story of what happened that day spread like wildfire. When 28 members of the resistance were turned in to the Russians 2 days later, a week-long spat between residents of the city erupted as resistance members began killing anyone and everyone they knew that was working as a collaborator with the Chinese. More than 600 civilians had been killed that week, and the infighting had only just started. Chapter 16. U.S. Northern Command. October 2021, Cheyenne Mountain. General Tibbets yawned and stretched his back a bit. He was tired. The war had been sucking the life out of him. Somehow, he'd managed to hold the military together up to this point, and he'd successfully discovered ways to beat the Chinese back in some areas and contain them in others. With the war in the north officially over, he was finally able to shift the bulk of those forces to the southern front, where they were desperately needed. He just hoped they weren't too late. Tibbets looked at his watch. He had about 40 minutes until his next major briefing. Given the time frame, he opted to head over to the briefing room and spend a few extra minutes looking over the maps. He liked maps. They allowed him to see the big picture, to really know what was going on and where the action was most likely going to be. In a way, he was fortunate that the country was as big as it was. He'd been able to trade space for time when necessary. Those sacrifices had also meant many millions of Americans had suddenly found themselves trapped behind enemy lines. It had pained him to have to abandon many of these great cities of the Southwest, but he didn't really have a choice. He needed time for General Marcus back in D.C. to train up an army large enough actually to win this fight, and time for America's manufacturers to crank out the tools and weapons needed to win it. As General Tibbets walked through the hallway on his way to the briefing room, he passed by many workspaces. Hundreds of people continued to work tirelessly, tracking the multitude of aerial contacts and monitoring the movements of friendly and hostile units. It was a daunting task, but it was necessary to help paint the broad picture of what was going on around them. They'd been steadily launching more satellites to replace the ones they had lost. For the time being, the Chinese had agreed to a global détente of sorts when it came to the world's satellite infrastructure. Britain and India had threatened the Chinese with military action if they shot down any more of their satellites, and the strategy seemed to be working. Tibbets finally made his way into the briefing room and walked right up to the digital map display on the wall of the conference room. He now had 28 minutes until the meeting with the various corps commanders and the service chiefs back at the Pentagon. They had some hard decisions to make that would have a profound impact on the war. The PLA had been sending nearly all of their reinforcements into New Mexico as they sought to capture Colorado. Thus far, the U.S. had been able to hold the PLA just south of Pueblo, in a small town called Colorado City. But no one knew if the Army would be able to hold that position for much longer. That is why Tibbets had called this emergency meeting. The 4th Infantry Division and 2 other National Guard divisions were spread too thin across the front lines. The enemy had continued to probe around the edges of their lines, looking for a weak spot they could exploit and use as a breakout point. This kept forcing the Americans to have to extend their lines or move units further away from the main front to protect their flanks. It was a strategy Tibbets quickly recognized as a means of weakening his center, so the PLA could punch a hole through them and drive their tanks toward the very installation where he now stood reviewing maps. Tibbets had to make sure the Chinese didn't find that weak point. The enemy was less than 93 kilometers as the crow flew from NORAD. They were getting dangerously close to the central nerve center running the war. If Tibbets didn't find a way to turn things around soon, they'd have to relocate the command. As it was, they had already started evacuating all the family members and non-essential personnel to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska. Normally, they'd relocate to the Pentagon, but the building had already been bombed once, and Raven Rock was thoroughly destroyed. The president had been very explicit that he didn't want to have all the military leadership in one location. Major General Brian Sims walked into the briefing room and joined Tibbets at the map. With a wry smile, he sarcastically stated, "We're pretty well screwed right now, aren't we?" Tibbets chuckled at the blunt assessment from his longtime friend. "Well, you always said you liked a decent fight," Tibbets countered with a wink. "I'm about to give you one hell of a good one." "I do like a good fight, but I don't like being surrounded in a sea of hostiles." General Tibbets slapped his friend on the shoulder. "Come on, Sims. You get the chance to shoot in all directions and still hit the enemy." The two laughed, and then for a few minutes they caught each other up on their families and what they'd been up to for the past month or so. It was like the war paused for those few moments when they stopped being military commanders and reverted to being old friends. Brian Sims had been a platoon commander in the 75th Rangers when he'd finished OCS, and Tibbets had been his battalion commander. Tibbets had really taken a liking to Sims. In fact, for the next couple of years, Tibbets had helped mentor the up-and-coming officer until Sims had been promoted to 06, and taken over command of a brigade that was gearing up to deploy to Iraq. They'd kept in touch throughout the years, and when Tibbets had made brigadier, he'd selected Sims to be one of his aides at the Pentagon. It had allowed Sims to meet some of the right players, and that had helped him to make colonel ahead of most of his peers. As Tibbets' career moved up, he'd done his best to take Sims with him. Now, Major General Sims was the commander of the 101st Airborne Division. The division had seen a ton of action in the Midwest before being shifted to the East Coast when the UN forces there had collapsed. Now the 101st had been transferred to the Southwest to try and slow the enemy down. After their little catch-up, the conversation took a more serious turn. "Are you serious about dropping us that far behind enemy lines?" Sims asked, prodding his mentor. "Is there a legitimate chance of us actually surviving the heliborne assault?"
"Under any other circumstances than what you're about to hear in a few minutes, I'd say no. However, the situation has changed, and it's about to transform for the better. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but let's just say we now have some allies coming to our aid at long last."
Sims smiled and nodded, and then he walked over to the seat reserved for him. Right behind his seat, 2 spots were reserved for his aides. They were his official scribes, and they'd also pass him questions to ask if they felt something needed to be clarified. As it neared the time for the brief, the room suddenly filled up. General Tibbets moved over to a seat at the center of the conference table. He cleared his throat.
"Gentlemen, ladies, before we start this meeting, I want to make you all aware of some new reinforcements that are arriving to help us out," he announced. "As of 2000 hours yesterday, the British have agreed to join the war and come to our defense. Even as we speak, the British 16th Air Assault Brigade is arriving at Peterson Air Force Base just down the road from us. Most of their equipment will begin to arrive via rail in the next 36 hours.
Almost everyone at the table smiled. A few quietly commented to one another. Many of the soldiers in the military had figured their European allies had abandoned them in favor of this UN peacekeeping force. It appeared their luck was changing, at least amongst the European allies who hadn't participated in the UN force. General Tibbets held a hand up to calm everyone down.
"The Polish 11th Armored Cavalry Division is also going to be arriving at Fort Carson. In the next couple of days, we're going to receive 22,000 additional soldiers, plus General Sims' 101st Airborne Division. We're finally going to stop the Chinese at Colorado City and push them out of the state." "Yes, sir," they answered in unison. "Now, in 48 hours, the British paratroopers and our own 101st Airborne are going to get dropped behind the enemy lines. They'll air assault into Walsenburg, while the British paratroopers will land approximately 25 kilometers south of them at a small city called Aguilar. Both drops place our forces along Interstate 25 and the main supply routes the PLA are using to keep their front lines operational. While this is happening, the 1st and 4th Infantry Divisions will launch a ground assault of the front lines with the 1st Cavalry Division and the Polish 11th Armored Cavalry Division. This will force the PLA to either engage our forces in front of them or withdraw to deal with the paratroopers in their rear area. In either case, we're going to make the enemy react to us instead of the other way around."
The division commanders spent the next hour going over some of the broader strategic goals and the units that would be involved before they broke to go figure out some of the finer details with their own brigade commanders. While the rest of the military leaders filtered out of the meeting to work on their plans, the 3rd Corps commander and the 2 Marine Corps division commanders stayed on the secured video teleconference with the service branch chiefs.
"Now it's time to make some tough decisions," thought Tibbets.
General Marcus, who was talking to them from the White House,
started the conversation. "General Tibbets, what's the plan with California?" he asked. "We've lost nearly the entire state to the PLA, and it appears they're bringing more and more troops into the state via the ports and airports." Tibbets had known the question was coming, so he had a ready answer. "Sir, the Marines have largely kept the PLA from capturing Las Vegas, which is a good thing. Losing Nellis and Creech Air Force bases would have had a huge impact on our ability to support our efforts out west. That said, we can't keep our forces in Northern and Central California properly supplied or supported. We're just spread too thin right now." "What about 1st Corps in Washington?" General Marcus suggested. "They've pretty much mopped up things in Washington State and British Columbia. Why don't we shift them south into Northern California?" "We've looked at that option. The issue is they're so spread out with occupation duty, they don't have enough forces to head down into California," Tibbets countered. "Plus, Oregon is still a mess right now. We need at least 1 or 2 combat brigades to clear out the resistance in Oregon before we could do anything." "Okay, then what do you suggest we do?" asked General Marcus, clearly frustrated by the lack of progress on the West Coast. "I hate to say this, but I propose we have what's left of our 2 Marine divisions pull back to the Oregon-California border and establish a new defensive line. At the same time, I propose we send the newly reactivated 4th and 5th Marine Divisions to Boise, Idaho. From there, they can use Interstate 84 and take it all the way to Portland. They can put down the uprising in the state and then move south to reinforce the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions. I'd also like to plus up Regimental Combat Team 1 that's been fighting it out from Yosemite National Park all the way up to Tahoe National Forest. It's a huge piece of rugged terrain that we need to hold if we're to keep the PLA out of Upper Nevada." General Miles Harris, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, jumped in. "I agree. I think we should also plus up RCT-1 with the 6th Marine Division. I know we had originally slated them for deployment to the Caribbean, but the fact is we need to hold the line in California. If the PLA is able to break out of the California pocket that we've kept them stuck in, it'll shift our entire line of defense." A lot of the generals at the table nodded, agreeing with his assessment. "Okay, I can see the merits in that plan," Tibbets conceded. "We'll move forward with that if General Marcus doesn't have any objections." Marcus tipped his head, deferring to the group. "What's the status of 5th and 6th Corps?" asked General Tibbets. "When am I going to have them released to my command?" He really wanted those 2 new corps that had been training up for the past 6 months. The vast majority of the new recruits were being filtered into these units to get them ready for combat. "In 2 weeks, I'll be able to release 5th Corps," General Marcus answered. "You'll also be getting the Polish 12th Mechanized Division and the British 3rd Division at the same time. We're going to marry them up with 5th Corps to give them some added armor punch. As to 6th Corps, it's going to be another 2 months before they're staffed up. We had initially wanted to use them in the Caribbean as we got closer to retaking the Panama Canal Zone. I'll have them released to you if you absolutely need them, but I'd have to take them away in November to get them ready for the next phase of the war." Tibbets nodded. "Let's wait and see what kind of difference the new Marine Divisions and 5th Corps will make. If we can stop the Chinese from capturing Texas, hold the line here, and keep the PLA bottled up in California, then I think we have a chance of defeating them as we move into 2022. "Okay then, that's the plan," agreed General Marcus. "Now it's my turn to bring you all up to speed on some recent intelligence we've gotten from Japan and the UK," he announced, effectively taking over control of the meeting. "The Chinese have dispatched 1.3 million militiamen to reinforce the regular PLA army," Marcus continued. "That number is expected to grow by nearly 100,000 soldiers a month. On top of that, they've sent some 600,000 Chinese People's Armed Police Force,
or PAPS, to Mexico and the occupied territories. Right now, a large percentage of that force is actually in Panama and the rest of Central America. But make no mistake, they're using them more and more in the American-occupied territories. General Marcus paused for a moment, seemingly calculating how to approach the next topic. "I have some rather disturbing news that's going to be made public," he said. "I wanted you guys to hear it from me first." Many of the officers in the room looked confused. Marcus continued. "Two of our Special Forces units uncovered some incredible news about horrific atrocities being committed in the occupied zones. The Chinese, for whatever reason, seem to be culling the population of the sick and elderly and essentially leaving only the young and healthy alive. We're not sure how they're killing off their marks, but teams on the ground have captured video of them dumping the bodies into mass graves just across the U.S.-Mexico border." A few quiet expletives rumbled through the room. "In California, one of our SEAL teams uncovered something that may be even worse," General Marcus pressed. "The Chinese appear to be rounding up young women and loading them onto transport ships. We believe the women are being sent back to mainland China, but we don't have any definitive proof of that yet. What we've learned, our operators, who are still hiding out in the major cities and providing us this intel, is that there's beginning to be a noticeable absence of women between the ages of 16 and 35. That demographic of women are apparently disappearing from the cities all over the occupied territories." General Tibbets shook his head in disgust and anger. It made him want to fight that much harder to make sure the PLA didn't capture any more of the country than they already had. "If we know this is happening, are we going to start releasing it to the media and the people?" Tibbets inquired. "This could help us turn those states that are still rebelling against the country back to the fold. If nothing else, it'll make our soldiers fight a hell of a lot harder if they know what's happening." General Marcus nodded. "Yes, that's why I wanted to be the one to tell you about this first. I wanted you to hear it from me before it's released. The President has directed the military, DOJ, and CIA to put this information out to the public in a coherent way, so it won't go out through selective leaks. They want to use it to rally the nation together. For now, I'll leave it up to your discretion how to disseminate that information to your subordinate commands." The group talked for a little bit longer about military production levels, recruitment progress, and some of the other minutiae involved in rapidly growing and equipping a multi-million-man army before the meeting was ended. It was time to get ready for one of the largest military operations since the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.